There is a photograph of Dale Tryon that the newspapers stopped using after 1996. In it, she is standing, bright, platinum-blond, broad-smiled Australian, beside the man who had become King Charles III. The Independent newspaper, writing on the morning after her death, stated that he had once called her the only woman who really understands me. After 1996, the photographs showed her in a wheelchair. The cause was a fall at Farm Place, a drug and alcohol rehabilitation clinic in Surrey. Not at her home, not in Wiltshire. At a medical facility she had entered voluntarily to treat an addiction that her cancer treatment had helped create. What the record does not contain is an official account of how she came to fall from that window. No police report has been located in any accessible public source. No coroner's finding names the manner of the fall. No statement from Buckingham Palace addressed the event in any archive consulted. The two most contemporaneous named British newspaper sources disagree on whether she fell from the first floor or the third. No named eyewitness to the moment itself appears in any source. What the record provides instead is a short, inconsistent, second-hand account, and the comprehensive absence of any official investigation. She survived. She spent 18 months in a wheelchair. She was in that wheelchair when her husband told her he wanted a divorce. She was there when the decree nisi was granted on 1st September 1997. She moved into the Ritz Hotel, still intending to celebrate her 50th birthday with a party. She never made it to 50. On 15th November 1997, 76 days after Diana died in Paris, Dale Tryon died at King Edward VII Hospital in Westminster from septicemia. She was 49 years old. Her 4 children and her brother were at her side. No statement from Buckingham Palace has been located in any accessible archive. The woman who had shared biographical space with Camilla Parker Bowles in every serious account of Charles's intimate relationships had become, in the end, the story the authorized version declined to write. Understanding why the silence around that window persists, why the question of how a woman fell from a window in a medical facility has never been officially resolved, requires understanding what she was and what she knew, and what the institution had practiced doing with people who occupied her position. Start in Melbourne. Start with the stillness. Dale Elizabeth Harper was born on 3rd January 1948, the eldest of 3 children of Barry Harper, a wealthy printing magnate, and his wife Jean. The family address was Toorak, Victoria, Melbourne's most affluent suburb, a neighborhood of Federation-era houses and private school catchments, the kind of street where children had nurses and houses had names. The material comfort was real. It didn't prevent what happened early. In childhood, she received 2 diagnoses. The first was Perthes disease, Legg-Calvé-Perthes disease in formal terms, a degenerative condition in which the blood supply to the ball of the femoral head is disrupted, causing the bone to soften and potentially deform within the hip socket. The second was spina bifida, incomplete closure of the vertebral column. The treatment for Perthes disease in Australian pediatric medicine of the late 1940s and early 1950s was immobilization. The femoral head had to be contained within the acetabulum during the period of avascular necrosis, allowing the bone to regenerate without mechanical stress. In practice, this meant bracing. Metal braces from her feet to her chest in a children's hospital for an extended period until approximately age 9. The Wikipedia article on her life, drawing on published biographical accounts, describes this precisely. Spending time in a children's hospital in irons, from feet to chest. The spina bifida added a separate and lifelong dimension. Incomplete closure of the vertebral column creates persistent orthopedic vulnerability. Nerve damage in varying degrees, structural instability in the lower spine, and, in the medical practice of the 1940s and 1950s, a regime of surgical intervention considerably more invasive than anything available today. A 2012 medical history study on spina bifida treatment noted that pre-1960s patients who survived into adulthood typically required ongoing orthopedic management across their lifetimes. Both of those things were true for Dale Harper. The surgeries continued into the early 1990s. The chronic pain from the spinal conditions contributed directly to the painkiller prescription that developed during her cancer treatment in 1993. That addiction contributed directly to her admission at Farm Place in 1996. The arc from the Melbourne Children's Hospital to the Surrey Rehabilitation Clinic isn't metaphorical. It's physiological. The child in irons and the woman who fell from the window were connected by a single, unbroken medical line that ran across 50 years. None of it broke her in any observable way. Every account of the woman she became describes someone driven by exactly the velocity that years of enforced stillness would produce in anyone who survived them. Family and friends described tremendous joie de vivre. The biographical record is consistent on this. She was direct and loud by English standards, apparently able to say to Charles things that people trained from birth in the particular refinements of English social performance simply couldn't manage. There is something structurally logical about that. She had not been trained in the same performance. She had been in a Melbourne hospital in irons. The social codes of Knightsbridge weren't the most consequential discipline she had navigated. She was also, by the biographical record, driven in the specific way that eldest children of strong-willed parents frequently are. The one who went furthest. The engine behind it wasn't abstract ambition, it was movement. She had been immobile for years. She wasn't going to stop. In the late 1960s, she took a position as a reporter for the Australian Women's Weekly, at the time, Australia's most widely circulated magazine, with an established London bureau covering the growing population of expatriate Australians who had made it to Britain. She moved to the publication's London office in 1969. An alternative account, from the West Australian's 2009 feature on her life, places her at Qantas before the London transfer, as a public relations officer who moved to the airline's London office around 1972. The two accounts disagree on the job title. They agree on the underlying professional formation. Whether she was filing stories or managing press relations, the training was the same. Being inside the institutional mechanics of information means learning how a tip becomes a story, how a source is protected, and how a source is exposed, how a newsroom decides what to print and what to hold. It means learning how an institution's preferred narrative gets placed, through trusted journalists, through well-timed briefings, through the social relationships between press officers and editors that make access flow in both directions. It means learning how the suppressed narrative gets found, which gaps in the official record are deliberate, and which reporter knows which gaps to look for. The relationship between a journalist and a source, in its actual operational form rather than its idealized version, is a transaction. Information flows in exchange for access, and both parties understand the terms. She learned all of this before she ever set foot in a royal household. When she entered that world, she wasn't a civilian who had married upward. She was a professional with specific formation in exactly the business that the royal institution had, for generations, been in the business of managing. She knew how coverage of a royal friendship worked. She knew who decided whether she became a story, and she knew how such decisions got made. That knowledge was, for most of the 1970s, simply one of her qualities. It became something more complicated later. She had first encountered Charles in 1966. He was on a school exchange program at Geelong Grammar School in Victoria, the flagship posting for a certain kind of English educational ambition. She was 16 years old. They met at a dance in Melbourne, brief, the way school dances are, but the kind of encounter that places two people in each other's biographical geography. It established that she preceded almost everything that followed. She was in Charles's world before Camilla, before Diana, before the marriage and the separation, and the authorized biographies that would eventually curate which women had mattered. She married Anthony George Merrick Tryon on 13 April 1973 in the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace, with royal permission formally required and granted for the use of the venue. The engagement had been announced in Australian newspapers the previous month. 25-year-old Dale Harper of Toorak, Victoria, and the wedding marked a formal, documented entrance into the peerage. According to Wikipedia, she met Anthony within 2 weeks of arriving in England, and he was already a member of Charles's inner circle when they met. Anthony, who became the third Baron Tryon on his father's death in 1976, was 32 at the time of the wedding, old Etonian, embedded in the prince's social life through field sports, fly fishing, and country properties. His father, Charles Tryon, the second Baron, had served as Lord Chamberlain to the royal household, a position of direct institutional service to the crown. Anthony himself didn't hold that office, but the family's relationship to the institution was structural, deep, and of long standing. The honeymoon was on Mystique. 4 children followed: Zoe in 1974, Charles in 1976, and twins Edward and Victoria in 1979. Prince Charles was the godfather of their son, Charles Tryon, a specific, named, formal bond of a kind that can't be reduced to social acquaintance. Through the 1970s, the Tryons' properties became regular fixtures of Charles's schedule. The manor house at Great Durnford, near Salisbury in Wiltshire, the Knightsbridge residence, the fishing lodge in Iceland, where Lord Tryon and the prince fished together on visits, documented in multiple biographies. These were the locations where she and Charles occupied the same rooms in the informal register, the private context that official life can't produce, and that the royal world depends on for relief from the formal performance of itself. What she offered in those rooms, by every biographical account, was something genuinely difficult for a prince to find. She said what she thought. She wasn't performing the English courtesy that smooths over what people actually mean. She was someone who had come up through a working press environment, who understood how institutional language functions as concealment, and who had no particular investment in maintaining the concealment. For a man whose life was structurally insulated from direct speech, this was remarkable. The biographies describe it in different registers depending on their sympathies, but the consistent core is this: she reached him in ways that the more polished people around him couldn't. The Independent's obituary, published 16 November 1997, the day after her death, carried what became the defining characterization. Lady Tryon, of whom Prince Charles said, "She is the only woman who really understands me." Journalist Roz Wynne Jones presented it as direct attribution but named no occasion, no year, and no witness to the original statement. The phrase appears in slightly different forms across sources. The only woman who ever understood me, in some accounts. The only woman who really understands me, in others. And reporting on her life explicitly raises the possibility that the characterization originated with Tryon herself rather than with Charles. No primary source anchors it to Charles directly. The honest label, which every account of her life should carry, widely repeated, second-hand, and traced to no verified primary attribution. First appearing in named print the day she died. The quote matters, and its sourcing matters equally. What does not require qualification is the structural access the friendship represented. Multiple Diana biographies place Camilla Parker Bowles and Kanga Tryon in the same sentence, grouping both as married female companions in Charles's inner circle through the same decade, described in period accounts as said to be mistresses in the classic sense. Anthony Tryon and the Tryon family have consistently denied the romantic characterization of his wife's relationship with Charles. The structural parallel between the two women is, regardless, present in the biographical record. In 1983, she opened the Kanga Boutique at Beauchamp Place in Knightsbridge, naming the label after the nickname Charles had given her, derived from kangaroo, his shorthand for her origins. The clothes were aimed squarely at the Sloane Ranger market. Distribution expanded across England, America, Australia, France, and Spain, with additional boutique branches in Salisbury, Hong Kong, and Dublin. The label's most documented public moment came in 1985, when Princess Diana wore a Kanga dress to the Live Aid concert at Wembley. The endorsement was spontaneous and unpurchasable, and the label benefited from it visibly. Around 1990, she launched a separate couture line, the Dale Tryon collection, using Italian and French textiles, a deliberate step up market. She also reportedly served as chairwoman of SANE, the mental health charity, through this period, a public role that wasn't fashion adjacent and that placed her on platforms where her name was attached to serious institutional credibility. Tina Brown, in The Palace Papers, would later treat the Kanga label dismissively. International distribution across 5 countries, couture expansion into European textiles, and a charitable chairmanship are harder to dismiss. What the fashion business represents in the context of this story is an independent platform, her own name in the press, her own public presence that existed independently of royal adjacency. The institution could reduce her access to Charles's inner circle. It couldn't fully reduce her profile because her profile was partially hers. Those are different problems. The comparison with Camilla Parker Bowles clarifies the precise shape of the vulnerability. Both women were in Charles's biographical orbit through the 1970s. Both were described in the same biographical terms, often in the same sentences. Camilla's bond with Charles was, ultimately, the deeper romantic priority. It survived Diana's marriage, survived the Camillagate tapes, survived Diana's death, and became the 2005 wedding and the 2023 coronation. Dale Tryon's bond didn't acquire that protective structure. Knowledge without the primary romantic bond is a different kind of exposure. It means access to a great deal of information about how the institution operates, without the protective status that being the central figure in the love story provides. When the palace needed to manage its narrative in the 1980s, the woman it most needed to manage wasn't Camilla, who was the authorized story. It was the woman who understood the story but didn't have the position that guaranteed her a role in the telling of it. The friendship's cooling happened in documented phases rather than at a single pivot point. The Independent's obituary states, "It cooled when he met Camilla Shand 4 years later," placing the first phase of the cooling around 1970, 4 years after the Melbourne dance. That is the source-documented timing of the initial shift. Charles met Camilla. Camilla became the emotional priority, and whatever dimension of intimacy had existed in the friendship with Dale found its structural ceiling. The friendship continued. Their families remained in social contact. Charles continued as godfather to the Tryon son. The Wiltshire house remained on the social calendar. But the particular register of closeness that the biographies describe from the mid-1960s onward had its first qualification around 1970. This is the most contemporaneous named sources account of the cooling's timeline, and it predates the 1980 pivot point by a decade. The second phase was the 1981 engagement to Diana Spencer, followed by the marriage. This contracted Charles's social geography in the predictable way that formal royal marriage contracts it. New household, new obligations, a wife with her own views on the women in his preceding social life. Getty Images has Dale Tryon at Ascot races in June 1989, which tells you the social relationship was never fully severed. But the rooms where the private conversations of the 1970s had happened were harder to reach. She remained visible through the fashion label. She was no longer indispensable. What she did with the press during this period matters. The biographical record is clear that she actively managed her own press access. On at least one documented occasion, she invited journalists to cover her return to work after a hospital stay, arranging coverage exactly as a former media professional would. She knew how to generate her own visibility, independent of the royal household's preferences. This is the thing that made her position qualitatively different from other women who drifted out of Charles's orbit. Most of them simply receded. She was equipped not to. The only formally documented instance of Charles publicly creating distance from her came in 1997, per Tina Brown's Palace Papers, after she had already been in a wheelchair for over a year. The statement declared that he was in touch with Kanga once or twice a year, and that they were no longer the closer friends they had once been. Tina Brown describes it as chilly. That word is accurate. A public declaration of social severance, issued in the passive voice, from a position of institutional power, directed at a woman who was paralyzed, being divorced, and had less than 5 months left to live. The statement didn't answer any question about what had happened at Farm Place. It answered the social question of whether she remained inside the circle. She didn't. The illness that made Farm Place necessary began with the cancer diagnosis in 1993. The same year, Charles and Diana formally separated. Uterine cancer, confirmed across multiple sources. Her reported response, cited in Australian press from early 1994. Ugh, what a bore. The preceding years had already involved major surgeries for her spinal condition. The cancer treatment required heavy prescription painkillers. The orthopedic management required painkillers. Wikipedia, drawing on named biographical sources, describes the result. A heavy dose of painkillers, combined with excessive quantities of vodka and champagne. The combination of prescribed opioids with alcohol in a patient managing both acute illness and chronic pain is a well-documented pathway to dependency. What developed was, clinically, an addiction. The cancer fight lasted 3 years. She was cleared in 1996. The Independent's obituary notes she was cleared of cancer this summer, in the year of her death, indicating the clearance came sometime in 1996 or early 1997. The addiction the illness had helped create wasn't cleared with it. She entered Farm Place voluntarily, to address what the cancer had left behind. That voluntary entry is important. She was there because she was trying to recover. She was in a medical facility staffed by professionals whose purpose was her treatment. She wasn't at the bottom of her life. She was at the part where you try to climb back. Farm Place, Surrey, late May 1996. One documentary source gives the specific date as 31st May. She fell from a window. Now comes the part the record does not explain. The most contemporaneous named print source on the fall is The Independent's obituary, written by Roz Wynne Jones and published 16 November 1997, more than 18 months after the event. It states she had been in a wheelchair after throwing herself from a first-floor window at a Surrey drug and alcohol rehabilitation clinic. The language is explicit. Throwing herself. It characterizes intent. It says suicide attempt. The Daily Telegraph's 2019 obituary of Lord Tryon states she fell from a first-floor window, broke her back, and became wheelchair-bound. Neutral language. Same floor. The majority of later retrospective sources, Wikipedia, the Scottish Daily Express, the New York Post, multiple documentary productions, describe a third-floor window at approximately 25 feet or nearly 8 meters. Those two height measurements are physically incompatible. A first-floor fall in British residential terms is roughly 3 to 4 meters. 8 meters is a fall from which a fractured skull and shattered spine are the expected consequence. A 3-meter fall does not typically produce permanent paraplegia and a broken skull. The injuries confirm a fall of significant height. The contemporaneous newspaper floor count is inconsistent with those injuries. The discrepancy has never been resolved in any accessible source, official or otherwise. Confirmed across all detailed accounts: fractured skull, broken back, permanent paralysis from the waist down. She survived. She spent the next 18 months as a paraplegic. Those facts aren't in dispute. What is confirmed absent: any named eyewitness to the moment of the fall in any accessible source. A Surrey police report, a coroner's finding, an inquest conclusion, a statement from Farm Place Clinic, a statement from Buckingham Palace addressing the 1996 event, any named clinical note or hospital admission record in the public domain. The accessible record contains an internally contradictory short account, a confirmed set of severe injuries, and the comprehensive absence of official investigative documentation. 3 theories exist in the record, and allegation discipline requires presenting all 3 as theories. The first is accident. A woman in residential treatment for drug and alcohol dependency, still in the physical aftermath of cancer treatment and long-standing spinal conditions, lost her footing near an open window. This requires no additional elements. It's consistent with the neutral language of the majority of retrospective sources. It can't be confirmed or disproved from available evidence. The second is deliberate self-harm. This is the specific framing of the Independent's obituary, the most contemporaneous named print source. Given the documented context, the contextual support is real. Addiction treatment facility, cancer diagnosis 3 years earlier, documented depression that would later result in Mental Health Act detention, a marriage failing, a social position that had contracted significantly from its 1970s peak. She was, by multiple verified accounts, in severe personal and physical crisis. No official finding confirms the self-harm characterization. No contemporaneous press coverage described a police investigation into a suicide attempt at the clinic. The third account is Dale Tryon's own, relayed through retrospective sources. The Mirror and the Daily Record both report that she told friends and family she had been pushed and believed someone was trying to kill her. A 2008 ITV documentary titled Prince Charles's Other Mistress included a reconstruction in which she reportedly told her son Charles, "I didn't jump, I was pushed." These are retrospective attributions, carried through documentary reconstruction and tabloid features, published years after the event. No sworn testimony, no contemporaneous documentation, no record before any official body. The formal classification of her eventual death in the official record is natural causes. The pushed account rests on her reported word, relayed secondhand. It can't be confirmed. It also shouldn't be dismissed solely on grounds of her mental state at the time. Clinical documentation of depression isn't a disqualification from accurate perception. Both of those things can be simultaneously true. Her account can't be confirmed, and it can't be dismissed simply because she was unwell. There is a separate claim that circulates widely in accounts of this story and deserves its own careful examination. Many tellings describe Dale Tryon as having a fear of heights so acute that she wouldn't approach an open window, presenting this as the piece of behavioral evidence that makes both the accident and self-harm theories untenable, and by process of elimination, points toward a third party. The research record for this claim is thin to the point of transparency. No named biography, no obituary, no contemporaneous press coverage, and no named source in any accessible archive describes Dale Tryon as acrophobic or as someone who avoided open windows. Not The Independent's detailed obituary from 16 November 1997. Not the paper's extended biographical account published 2 days later. Not any named book source covering her life. The only located reference in accessible sources is an anonymous comment posted to a social media discussion platform in 2025 in an online thread about her life. The commenter states they had recently listened to an interview with Dale Tryon in which she allegedly said she wouldn't jump from windows. The comment identifies no interview, supplies no date, names no publication, and provides no transcript. It's anonymous, posted 29 years after the fall, and refers to an unidentified source. That is the complete evidentiary foundation for the fear of heights claim, an anonymous online comment from 2025. This matters because the claim circulates as if it were established biographical fact, and it carries significant rhetorical weight. Once you accept that she would never voluntarily approach an open window, the accident and self-harm theories both become implausible, and the third-party explanation becomes the only available one. The claim short-circuits the honest examination of competing evidence. Examined on its actual sourcing, it can't carry that function. It should be identified, wherever it appears, as unverifiable. It can't be established as a statement Tryon made before the fall. It can't be confirmed as the testimony of a named witness who knew her. Removing it from the evidentiary ledger does not end rational suspicion about what happened at Farm Place. The rational suspicion rests on the documented pattern of the institution's behavior toward inconvenient women. And that pattern is real and documented without the acrophobia claim. It simply can't rest on a single unverifiable behavioral assertion from an anonymous source. After Farm Place, the disintegration was swift and documented. She had been left a paraplegic, paralyzed from the waist down, requiring continuous care. Her daughter Zoe slept beside her through the night, rolling her over regularly to prevent the pressure sores that would ultimately kill her. The care requirements were round the clock. Her husband Anthony told her he wanted a divorce. On 17 June 1997, more than a year after the fall, she was detained under the Mental Health Act 1983 for 28 days, following an incident involving bizarre behavior in Great Durnford. The sectioning is documented specifically to that date by the Scottish Daily Express. The Daily Records account, which places it shortly after the fall, is chronologically imprecise. The documented date is June 1997, 14 months after the fall at Farm Place. The decree nisi was granted on 1 September 1997. She renounced the title of Lady Tryon and returned to her maiden name, Dale Harper. She moved into the Ritz Hotel with plans to celebrate her 50th birthday there with a party for friends. The decree absolute was still pending when she was admitted to hospital. In her final months, she traveled to Australia to visit her mother, and then to India for homeopathic treatment from an Indian homeopathic physician Charles had introduced to her. The treatment reportedly included shark's cartilage, aloe vera, and carrot juice. She became seriously ill on the return to England and was admitted to King Edward VII Hospital in Westminster, where doctors found severe complications from pressure sores. She underwent plastic surgery to address them. It was insufficient. On 15 November 1997, Dale Tryon died. Septicemia, blood poisoning, originating in the infection that had developed from those pressure sores. The causal chain runs without interruption. Farm Place created the paralysis. The paralysis created the immobility. The immobility created the pressure sores. The pressure sores created the sepsis. The sepsis killed her. She was 49 years old, 11 weeks short of the birthday she had intended to mark at the Ritz. Her £1.3 million estate was left to her 4 children. Her 4 children and her brother Derek Harper were with her at the end. The family statement described a woman of tremendous vitality and zest for life. Diana had died on 31st August 1997 in Paris. The interval was 76 days, just under 11 weeks. The proximity has generated a persistent sentiment that the wrong woman died, that the death that was seen by the world wasn't the one that carried the greater loss in historical terms. That sentiment is worth examining carefully rather than simply reproducing. One of these 2 women had spent years constructing a public record, giving testimony on the record, making her knowledge part of the documented world in a form that would survive her death. Diana, her true story, had been published in 1992. The tapes were in circulation. The Panorama interview had aired in 1995. Whatever Diana knew, she had arranged for it to outlast her in a way that meant the institution couldn't simply decline to write the story. The other woman had arranged none of this. What Dale Tryon knew about Charles, about the royal household, about the informal social world of the inner circle across 30 years, it existed in her memory, in whatever correspondence survived, and in the knowledge of a small number of people who had been in those rooms with her. After 15 November 1997, it was, for practical purposes, inaccessible. In 1998, Penny Junor published Charles, Victim or Villain, released to coincide with Charles's 50th birthday. HarperCollins described it as a portrait of the 3 people in the royal marriage: Charles, Diana, and Camilla. The timing was deliberate and noted as such in contemporaneous reviews. An academic article on media management of the British monarchy described the birthday-timed publication as purposeful PR positioning. The book's palace-briefed character is documented across multiple independent sources. Charles, the heart of a king, states plainly that someone within the palace had briefed sympathetic royal chroniclers, naming Junor alongside Jonathan Dimbleby, the author of another Charles biography, acknowledged that their own book had been well briefed. These descriptions are consistent and documented across sources that aren't themselves palace sympathetic. The book's described focus, 3 people, tells you who is in the authorized version, and by implication, who isn't. Dale Tryon, who appeared alongside Camilla in virtually every serious biographical account of Charles's intimate relationships published across 2 decades, who had known him since a Melbourne dance in 1966, who had hosted him across 3 properties over 30 years, whose death produced the definitive attribution in The Independent the very day she died, does not appear as a meaningful subject in any promotional description, publisher summary, or accessible account of the book's content. She isn't one of the 3. She isn't the 4th. She is absent. This is how institutional narrative management works at its most refined level. You don't suppress someone who can no longer speak, whose marriage has ended, who spent her last year in a wheelchair between a rehabilitation clinic and an Indian homeopathic regimen, and who died 2 months before your authorized biography goes to press. You simply don't include her. The palace-briefed biography of Charles's emotional life, published 1 year after her death, organized its narrative around 3 people and found no space for the woman who occupied the same biographical territory as one of them in every other account of his relationships. Not mischaracterized, not handled badly, omitted. That is a different kind of erasure from being pushed from a window. It's quieter. It's deniable. It works after death, when the subject can't respond to the framing or correct the record. And it completes, in authorized form, a process that had been running incrementally since the early 1970s, the gradual removal of Dale Tryon from the story of the man she had known longest. Dale Tryon spent her childhood strapped into braces in a Melbourne children's hospital, and her final 18 months in a wheelchair, and in between she spent 3 decades standing closer to the future king than almost anyone alive outside his immediate family. The fall that divided those 2 periods of immobility has a contradictory account, a missing official record, and 3 theories for what happened, none confirmed by anybody with the authority to confirm anything. The fear of heights claim, frequently cited as the decisive piece of the puzzle, traces to an anonymous post from 2025 and can't be verified as pre-fall testimony or as the statement of any named witness. The pushed theory rests on her own reported account, relayed retrospectively through documentary reconstruction and tabloid features. The accident and self-harm theories have contextual support and no official closure. In every direction, the silence is complete. The question of who benefits from that silence has an honest answer that doesn't require a conspiracy. By May 1996, she was already managed. Paraplegic, being divorced, removed from the social circuit she had spent 30 years navigating, no longer in any position to brief the press or exercise the professional instincts she had spent a career developing. The institution didn't need to explain the fall at Farm Place. The fall had already completed the work. What the silence tells us isn't necessarily that a crime occurred. It tells us that an institution with a long, documented practice of managing inconvenient women through social drift, press briefing, and authorized narrative, an institution that had been applying exactly those tools to Dale Tryon for 3 decades, looked at the window and decided it didn't need to look further. The push the record can support wasn't through a window. It was the push that began around 1970, when Camilla restructured the friendship's terms. It continued through the 1981 marriage, through the progressive narrowing of access across the 1980s, through the 1997 public statement of distance issued while she was paralyzed and dying, and through the 1998 biography that organized the authorized history of Charles's relationships and found 3 people worth writing about. No one needed to push her out of the royal story. The institution had already pushed her out of it, by degrees, over 3 decades, through every tool it had, none of which required a window. The window just made the exclusion physical. The silence made it permanent. Death didn't take the wrong woman in 1997. It took the one who knew.